Kia ora, guys. My name is Chris Clancy. I am the AP Euro lead teacher here at Fiveable. I want to apologize. We were supposed to do the stream on Tuesday. I had to move it to today. I've been sick for the last week and a half. Today's the first day I felt human enough to actually do this. So I wanted to be sure I could give you guys all of my attention and the best stream that we can do possible. I am streaming to you live here from New Zealand. I moved here recently back in June. I was an AP Euro teacher, an AP World teacher in the United States, as well as an AP World reader. So with that, let's just jump right on in. I did post a poll for you guys, as well as a question that as we go throughout the stream, I'd like for you guys to hop in and answer. We'll go over that at the end. And as I bring up our presentation on the side chat, I just want to see, where are you guys currently in European history? Are you guys at this time period? Are you before it, or are you past it? We're trying to make sure that we are trying to stay with a steady pacing. Okay, so English Civil War, so you're in the middle of this. Good to know. So we're doing a pretty okay pacing for you. I know that when I was teaching this in the States, this is roughly where I would be. Normally, start in November is when I try to get into the French Revolution. So hopefully we are not going too fast for you. Don't forget, though, you can always come back to these and we watch them if we are going faster than your teacher. And then just a heads up, November and December, we are going to be adding a lot of skills streaming. So SAQ, DBQ, LEQ writing, analysis, things like that. So that you guys can get some really good work in there, because second semester is where we tend to focus a lot on those, as well as the content. So again, this is the Absolutism versus Constitutionalism stream. My name is Chris Clancy. This is a wrap up of all of the previous streams that we've done over the English Civil War, over French absolutism, Russian absolutism, so that you guys can kind of get a good overview of the whole topic. Make sure that you are following Think Fiveable on Twitter, on Instagram, on YouTube, on all of the social medias. It is how we stay in contact with you guys. It is how we let you know what the goings on are. I tweet out all the time when I'm doing streams, so you can follow me if you'd like as well. It's at USTeachInNZ. And I tweet out all the other ones that the Fiveable is doing. So make sure you follow us so you can keep following along. We do have some streams coming up tomorrow. We have the Enlightenment, introduction to that, on at 8 p.m. That will be hosted by Sherry Liang. That's a great stream to do right after this one, so join us again tomorrow. Excuse me. Following Sherry at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time will be Bella Blanton going over Enlightened Absolutists and how that differs from just a regular absolutist. So it's a very important stream. I highly recommend you guys go and watch that one. And then on Halloween, I know a lot of you are probably going to want to go out and get candy or go to a party. In between all of that, so take time to join us and Stephen Kuklik as he goes over the European family in the 1700s at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. These are some great streams that I highly recommend that you join us for. So in this stream, what it's going to be about, it's about absolutism, what absolute control is, constitutionalism, why didn't it work, why absolutism, excuse me, did not work in England, and then looking at the two of them together and comparing them. The point of this stream is to be very straightforward. Again, it's a wrap-up stream, okay? It's going to be taking all of the things that the other streams were about and putting it all together in a nice, neat little package. Again, I apologize if I cough or anything in between this. Just been trying to fight. Hopefully it's just cold, probably the flu. So absolutism, what is absolutism? So absolutism has a lot of different definitions. The first thing that I think we tend to actually mistakenly do as teachers, we tend to introduce absolutism as this new idea, when in reality it's not. Absolutism has been around since the beginnings of monarchies. Okay, the ancient pharaohs of Egypt were absolute rulers. The Roman emperors were absolute rulers. The Chinese leaders were absolute rulers. The Japanese emperors were absolute rulers. So it's not a unique thing to develop in Europe. It's not a new thing to develop in Europe within the last 500 years. The reason why we look at it at this time frame, though, is because of why it develops. Okay, And one of the biggest reasons that it develops is actually the uncertainty and the destruction of the Protestant Reformation. One of the ways in which kings were trying to exert their power over the church was this idea of being an absolute ruler. Now, France, while it was a Catholic country, they still were trying to exert themselves over the church. And you actually had Cardinal Richelieu, as well as Bishop Bossuet, hopefully I'm not butchering that name, who preached the idea of the divine right. Okay, and where did they get this idea? They were getting it from the Bible, that God had appointed the kings of the Bible, therefore God had appointed King Louis XIV and other monarchs to be in charge. Absolutism is all about sovereignty. Who has the right to rule? Who is the one who is in power? In this case, sovereignty is held only within the hands of the monarch. Yes, you might have a parliament. You might have nobility who thinks that they can check the king. You might even have the idea of a constitution in some countries. But under absolutism, power is only held within the hands of the monarch. You are going to have nobles that are going to try to stop this. In France, they have what's known as the Estates General. The French nobles, they're part of the Second Estate, and the French king is supposed to call the Estates General before he does any kind of tax raising or anything like that. We're going to see how he doesn't do that. In England, you have Parliament. In Russia, you have the boyars. Those are the Russian nobles. Russian politics, very dirty, very backroom. And they were not afraid to kill publicly if needed to make sure that the Tsar knew that his power only could go so far. Absolutism at this time, again, it's a precursor to enlightened despotism or enlightened absolutism. Those terms are interchangeable, as well as totalitarian dictators in the 20th century. When we compare totalitarian dictators to like Louis XIV, there's a lot of similarities that we see. And so we can kind of get a taste of what it's going to be like with the 20th century when we look at absolutism now. So commonly, we tend to stick to really just the three countries that we talk about with absolutism: England, France, and Russia. Some people will throw in Prussia at the time, but really we tend to stick with those three. We've got Louis XIV of France here, obviously, and Peter the Great. More uncommonly known, though, was that absolutism also was being developed in other areas. Prussia being the example, where you have Frederick I and III, who was known as the Great Elector, Frederick William the Great Elector. You have Frederick III of Denmark, Norway, not the same people. Okay, you've got Sweden with Charles IX and Charles XI, who tried to be absolute rulers. Kind of works, kind of doesn't work, because the Swedes have a very strong parliament at that time. So there is an acquiescence to absolutism for a little bit, and then eventually the Swedish parliament's like, never mind. Okay. When we talk about Austria and we talk about Prussia later on, we tend to be talking about them as enlightened despots more than we do as just straight absolutists. Now, that's not to say that they didn't have absolutism. They were developing absolutism. It just didn't develop as quickly as it did in places like France or Russia. So don't think that you've been learning something different if your teacher's been talking about like Leopold I of Austria or something like that, because again, Austria is developing absolutism. It's just taking its time to get there. So absolutism, it's all about absolute control, okay? There is this saying that I learned when I was in college in one of my political science classes: absolute power corrupts absolutely. And this is really true here for the idea of absolutism, because the way it's all based around is this divine right monarchy. The divine right of kings is that if God did not want them to have the power, God would not have made them the king by birth. They would have been born to a different mother and father. Again, they're using the Bible to defend the power grabbing of the monarch. Referring back to kings like King David, King Solomon, as well as to New Testament, with the idea of an absolute ruler and the acquiescence to Paul and the emperor, because Paul was a citizen of Rome and using Rome's political structure to his advantage. They're drawing the very politics from the words of Holy Scripture. That is from Bishop Bossuet. And there is a really good excerpt in the Spielvogel textbook from Bishop Bossuet about politics being drawn from the words of Holy Scripture. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend you go back and do. And you can see where they're getting this idea of divine right, right? Under absolute control, government is being divinely ordained, okay? Normally we think of as government as a way to kind of protect us. We give up certain rights so that they can protect us from destruction. But in the case of absolutism, they're saying, no, government is divinely created because otherwise humans can't live in an organized society. So this is the beginnings of the Enlightenment time period. Remember, we overlap. Okay, Enlightenment time period starts in the 1600s. It doesn't just all of a sudden boom, Enlightenment after absolutism. They're overlapping. So it kind of does go against this idea that in order to have a civilized, organized society, we as the people have to decide to give up certain rights, not all of our rights, but certain rights to be ruled for that protection. In absolutism, you didn't have any rights to begin with because the government was created by God and God alone. Okay. Under this belief, monarchs are responsible to absolutely no one. Not you, not me, not parliaments, not the other nobility. The only being that they are responsible to is God. And if God does not want them to be the king or queen, God will remove them from power. And so this is where we see the biggest difference between absolutism and constitutionalism. Because in America, oftentimes we, you're endowed by your creator with certain unalienable rights. God has given you these rights. So on the one hand, the absolutists are saying God has taken away all your rights because you didn't have any and given them to the king. And in constitutionalism, God has given you rights. It's this really interesting dichotomy of how we use God and Bible and faith as a basis for both, okay? Monarchs, the way that they do this is pretty simple. It's not like they do it overnight. It takes time to become an absolute ruler. You can't just declare yourself an absolute ruler unless you've inherited an absolute kingdom. France did not start as an absolute kingdom. It had to have been created, and that took time. And so the way they do that is monarchs grant themselves privileges. These are small things that say only the monarch can do. I'll give you an example of something that you might not think is that important, but we'll think of tea, okay? England, very well known for drinking tea. They have tea time. You have morning tea, afternoon tea, high tea. They love their tea. Only one company is allowed to serve tea to the queen. And that is because the queen has the power to grant a royal patent, or patent, as they say. Well, that was a privilege that the monarchy gave themselves, that they're the only ones who can say, this is the tea of England, right? And that's Twinings. They received their royal patent, I want to say back in the maybe 1700s. It's very old. And that is the only tea that the queen drinks. So the queen kind of can dictate what is served at her residencies, whether it's at Sandringham, whether it's at Buckingham Palace, whether it's at Windsor Castle. And it doesn't sound like much, but if we start with the small things, we can grow to the bigger things. It's actually a psychological concept too as well. It's called the foot in the door phenomenon. All right, if I come to you and I say, hey, can I have $1,000? You're more than likely going to say no. But if I come to you and say, hey, can I borrow $5? You're more than likely going to say yes because it's a small amount. And if I start asking in small increments and then grow to larger increments, I can convince you over time to do what I want. It's the same thing with absolute control. Okay, so they're using that phenomena. They didn't know it at the time. They're using that foot in the door phenomena with these privileges, small things that eventually over time, the monarch can just do whatever he or she pleases in everything. Really good way to kind of remember absolutism is it comes down to these three things. It's divine right, meaning God ordained. Absolute monarch means the monarch is the sole power, the sole authority in all of the land. And it is complete control. There is no sharing of power. There is no devolution of power. Devolution is where we take power from the top and spread it around. This is a centralization of power. It's all coming together in one. With the divine right of kings, what that really does is that also prevents people from arguing on a religious level. Because if you're going to go against the king, now you're also going against God. Okay, we already know that we have the whole Protestant Catholic issue. And if we take that to another level, well, now we've got Protestant Catholic and believer and non-believer, because the king is, whatever his religion is, he's saying, God ordained me. You attack me, you're attacking God. That means you're not a believer. So even if you were Catholic and in France and you didn't believe in divine right, you couldn't say anything because you essentially would be going against not just the king, but the Catholic Church as well. So it's this manipulation of religion as well to prevent people from kind of exerting themselves into the political discussion. Again, absolute power corrupts absolutely, okay? Just keep that in the back of your mind. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So constitutionalism, on the other hand, constitutionalism is this idea of rules and regulations, okay? A constitution itself basically defines what is government. Okay, our Constitution is the United States of America. We have what's known as a democratic republic. Technically speaking, that means we're not a democracy. Or you can say that we are what's also called as an indirect democracy. Okay, these are all political science theories that you study in college if you go into political science. But really what it means is that we like to take things and simplify it. Constitutionalism is anything but simple. You have multiple forms of constitutionalism. England is a constitutional monarchy, but they don't have a constitution. There is no formal written constitution for England. And so for them, they're drawing from a lot of different documents to make up their government. While us as Americans, we draw from one. We draw from the United States Constitution, okay? The Constitution also limits the power of government. In the United States, we divide our government. We have three branches. We have this federal and the state government. We have federalism. People are the rulers. That is the idea of how we limit the government. In England, we limit the government by the way of limiting the power of the monarch to control purse, okay? And we'll talk about what it means to control the purse in a little bit. Constitutionalism typically does guarantee the liberty of the individual. Now, there are different levels of guaranteeing that liberty. We're talking in the 16 and 1700s now, so the liberty is not going to be for women, ever. It's just not going to happen. As much as we would like it to, and as much as you might find some historians who will talk about the power that women had, they're really only talking about the power of the noble women. Right? The average woman is just not going to get anything. She's too far down on the ladder in order for there to have any rights. For the most part, women really don't get any rights in any country around the world until the late 1800s. And then eventually we see rights slowly and surely being given to everybody. But women really do get screwed in this regard. It's one of those continuities that have happened all throughout history, whether it's from 5,000 years ago to 100 years ago. Women have always been in the background instead of at the forefront. And it's taken us a while. Hopefully we can continue to grow that and that women are be more and more in the forefront. But just keep that in the back of your mind that when we talk about individual rights and the liberties, we're not talking about women. We're talking about men, rich men in the beginning as well. Normally it was reserved for nobles. Excuse me. Constitutions also say that a government must have consent of the governed. Now, this is an interesting idea. Consent can be given in quite a few different ways. Consent in the United States is simple. You're born, therefore you are given consent. Right? We have absolute citizenship, meaning that if you were born in the United States, does not matter when or where, you are an American citizen, even if your parents are not. Other countries, it's not necessarily like that. In the UK, you must actually submit to becoming a subject of the Queen or the King before you can be governed by the government. Now, that doesn't mean you can't ignore the law. You have to follow the law. But what it does mean is that you can't vote on those laws. You can't vote on the people that make those laws. Okay. So in England, the consent that you're giving is you're saying, okay, fine, I am a subject of the Queen. Technically speaking, the United Kingdom does not have citizenships. It has subjugation, technically, right? We're talking very technical definitions of words here. But the reason why I'm saying it's so important to understand that is because under constitutionalism, those technicalities can mean the difference between who's in power and who's not in power. In the United States, we use the term citizen to define only white, rich, land-owning men in the beginning. We slowly adapted over time to include poor men, still landowning, but poor. And then we slowly included just men, white, had to be white. And then we eventually added African American right after the Civil War. We took it away, but we added it. We eventually would add white women. And then finally, we've added almost everybody that lives in the United States now: Hispanic, African American, Asian, women, men, young, old. Those are things that we can use by defining what the term citizen means. In England, a subject is a subject is a subject. And that became an issue for them in the 1800s because they're arguing, if I am a subject of the Queen or the King, then therefore under the laws of the United Kingdom, they all apply equally. As we know, politicians are really good at the spin, and that obviously was not going to be used in the correct term. But it's just an interesting way for you to remember that constitutionalism, it's not neat and nice in this package that we like to think of it as, okay? In the beginning of constitutionalism, the nobles are the ones who are going to control the government. You had to be born into a noble family. You could not be a rich person or a poor person and work in the government. Eventually, the bourgeoisie, the rich middle class, works their way into controlling the government, but you still had to have money. Excuse me. That whole concept right there of having to have money was very important because in the UK, it was one of the ways that they kept so many of their citizens from participating in the government. They did not pay parliamentarians until the mid-1900s. Okay, we're talking post-World War II. Prior to that, generally speaking, you had to have been rich so that you could just completely leave your job. If you or I were to run for a parliament in 1901 and we were to win and we weren't rich, we'd be in the poorhouse because the government did not pay us to run the government. Now today, it's different. Everyone gets paid to work for the government in England, but that was something that had to develop over time. That's why we're talking about the fact that nobles and then the rich controlled the government. It's just a way to keep people down, okay? So when we look at England, always this question gets asked every year by my students: why didn't absolutism develop in England? It should have developed in England. And theoretically, they are correct. It should have. The reason why it didn't, though, there are some very important reasons. Okay, the first is the fact that England, it's not part of the continent. It is an island. Yeah, it's not that far. I think it's like 30 miles at the smallest section of the English Channel from Dover to Calais. Don't quote me on that. But that 30 miles is a big difference back in those days. Okay, you might as well have been going from New York to California on your foot. All right, people aren't going to do it. And so because of that, certain ideas did not make it from the mainland to England. And even if those ideas did make it to England, they didn't make it in enough time, or they didn't make it in enough force for it to have taken hold. Also, unlike the continent, England was still very divided in religion. Okay, remember after the 30 Years' War, even though the continent said we're not going to fight over religion, the continent is pretty much divided. Northern Europe is going to be Protestant, Southern Europe is going to be Catholic. Never saw the two meet. Okay, England, you've got Catholics, you've got Protestants. You've got Presbyterians, you've got Puritans, you've got Congregationalists, you've got Pilgrims. All of these different religious groups are in one very tiny country. So there's no unity for the monarch to say that the Bible tells me so, because they all have different opinions on the Bible. To me, the most important part, though, is this idea of the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was signed by King John in 1215. Okay. If you've ever heard anything about Robin Hood, Robin Hood, first off, was probably a real person. Whether he was named Robin Hood, who knows? Okay. But what we do know is that one, King John did abuse his power a lot. He abused it to the point that the barons at that time all had an uprising against him. Rather than kill him, what they did is they forced him to sign the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was this document that basically said that the king cannot raise taxes without the consent of the barons. So it laid the groundwork for Parliament. It also said that the king cannot just declare somebody to go to death. So it laid the groundwork for having judges and the rule of law. In the Magna Carta, power was pretty much shared between Parliament and the king. I would say the king probably had a little bit more still at that time, all right? Because even though he couldn't raise taxes or kill anybody, he still had a lot of other powers. Eventually, that balance is going to shift to what we see today, where the queen, she's a figurehead for the most part. She does have some power, but for the most part, she's a figurehead, and Parliament is what's in charge. And this is where we get into the idea of a division of government. You have the head of state versus the head of the government. In the United States, it's the same thing. The president is the head of state and the head of the government. In France, for example, today, they have a prime minister who is the head of the government. Very ceremonial, doesn't really do anything. You also have the president, who right now is Emmanuel Macron. Excuse me, he is the head of state. He has the power because he is the one that power has been vested in. Excuse me, I apologize again. In England, you have the Queen. The Queen is the head of state. Now, I live here in New Zealand, and it's very funny when I go to a school and I talk to the kids, and I always ask them, who's the head of your government? And they tell me Jacinda Ardern, because that's the prime minister. And I say, well, who's the head of your state? And they repeat themselves, Jacinda Ardern. And I'm like, no, you guys forget, you're a monarchy. New Zealand is an example of a monarchy where people forget that they're a monarchy. Okay, the Queen is the head of the state here. And this is when we see absolutism can really strip the queen or the monarch of power. Because here, her role is purely ceremonial. She has no power. Okay, anything that the parliamenteer passes, there is a governor general who represents the queen, and he or she just basically rubber stamps what the government passes. But it wasn't always like that. Okay, that had to develop over time, just like constitutionalism in the UK itself had to develop over time. So just remember, constitutionalism is all about power sharing and dividing. Because if we follow that maxim, absolute power corrupts absolutely, how do we prevent it? No one has absolute power. No one can control everything at once. So how did it develop in England? We have to go back to the Tudor dynasty. So the Tudor dynasty was founded by Henry VII when he married Elizabeth of York. And his son is probably the most famous of the Tudor dynasty, Henry VIII. He's the one who starts the Church of England. He had 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. All of them become rulers of England. All of them are going to technically be some form of absolute monarch. Mary tries to reinstitute Catholicism with an iron fist, giving her the maximum Bloody Mary. Elizabeth, she was a very astute politician and very well at manipulating the people around her. So she's able to manipulate people so that she stays in power. Edward, he doesn't stay in power very long because he dies. But while he was in power, he did try to rule somewhat as an absolute monarch because he tried to use the church as his right hand. When Elizabeth dies, though, and she has no heir, that brings in the Stuart dynasty. Now, under the Stuart dynasty, this is where we see the power struggle happen, okay? Because James Stuart, or King James VI of Scotland, was used to ruling without a parliament. The Scottish Parliament really was a rubber stamper. That's just basically what they did for him. In England, when he became James I, that's where he ran into problems. Now, part of that, again, is religion. James was a Protestant, but he wasn't an Anglican Protestant. He was a Presbyterian. England, was officially Anglican, or what Americans would call Episcopalian. When he becomes the King of England, he's all of a sudden the head of the Anglican Church, which was different. And in some cases, it's very different. A lot of people call Anglicanism Catholic light because it has a lot of the look and feel of the Catholic Mass and the Catholic service without the Pope. In England itself, Parliament was very used to having the power, very used to being the ones to control things. But with the ascension of King James I and VI, this divided them. If you were Presbyterian, Congregationalist, which most people don't hear about anymore, it's a very early form of almost, you can say, old style church. That's what they called themselves, old style, meaning there was no leadership. Everyone was equal. It voted on everything. It's very early form democracy. And then the Puritans, who were extreme Anglicans. They wanted to purge the government, purge the church of all Catholic vestiges. That's why they're called Puritans. They were very much favored by Parliament. They wanted the Parliament to be the final word. Anglicans and Catholics, even though they disagreed on who's in charge, wanted the king to be the one to rule. That's setting up the problem, okay? That's why constitutionalism develops in England, because there is no agreement, okay? Constitutionalism allows for this disagreement, but still to function, okay? So there was quite a few ways that absolutism was prevented within England. We've already talked about the fact that the Magna Carta was signed in 1215. And again, England does not have a formal written constitution like the United States. Even to this day, they still do not have a formal written constitution. A lot of people don't understand what that means, and because to them, they can't kind of fathom that there's no document that guides the country. But for England, it works, okay? Because the way that England works is it rules under the idea of precedent or common law. The United States does this as well in almost all areas, with the exception of one notable one, which is Louisiana. Louisiana, due to the fact that it was controlled by the French for so long, follows the French system, which is very different, okay? But common law is everywhere else in the United States, okay? Common law basically means that if it's 2019 and you stole a loaf of bread, me as the judge, before I sentence you, I am going to look, how has somebody who has stolen bread been sentenced before? If they've been given 2 years of jail, I'm going to give you 2 years of jail. If they've been sentenced to death, I'm going to sentence you to death. But if they've been given 2 years of jail, I can't sentence you to death. The punishment doesn't fit the crime then. There's no precedent for that. Okay? That's the big thing about common law. It sets precedent. It gives the basis for how we're supposed to run our country. Okay? Parliament is given what's known as the power of the purse. Power of the purse is what we call the most important part of our government in America as well. It's what Congress has. Basically, if we want to raise taxes, the president can outline whatever they want. And they do all the time. The presidents outline, this is what they want to have seen done by Congress. And Congress can look at that and go, that's an idea. That's not going to happen. And then they do. They've done that before. The president has gone before, done the State of the Union, and said, I want to, raise taxes to build the giant bunny farm. I don't know why I said bunny farm, but we'll go with bunny farm. And Congress listens and they clap along. And then at the end, they all go, that's not going to happen. And nothing ever does. Because Congress is the one who decides how taxes are raised and spent. For some reason, we seem to have forgotten this in America, the president does not have that power. Only Congress. But we didn't come up with that. We came up with that from Britain. Parliament in Britain is the only ones who have the power to decide what taxes are raised and how they're spent. See, there was a question asked here on the right from Lucia. So they only have the Bill of Rights, laws, and precedent. Yes, that is correct, Lucia. They've got the Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights of 1888, 1889, and precedent. You're correct. They do not have that formal written document. It's very shocking, right? Because you think, what is there to protect people? The Constitution was specifically written to protect the people in America. In England, it's not that they don't need a constitution. It's the idea that precedent is so strong that they haven't needed it yet. Now, that's not to say they won't get one. I wouldn't be surprised if they do. How is it even called constitutionalism? It's a very good question. I've actually wondered that myself before, right? And tried to figure out why is it called constitutionalism. And I asked a professor this one time, and what my professor said is this was a term that we put on them as historians. They did not call this constitutionalism. They would have just called this government. Okay. Today is we call it constitutionalism because it does follow the pattern of constitutionalism, the limiting of the power of the ruler. Okay. Let me get to that question in a few minutes, Katie, and I will answer that for you. But I will answer that question for you. So in England, they have a bicameral or two houses of parliament, just like we have in the United States. England has the House of Lords. Sorry, my cat has decided to join us again. This is Roku. If you haven't joined us before, he comes and joins us usually about this time. So the House of Lords, this is made up only of nobles. You must have a title, whether it is Duke, whether it is Marquis, whether it is Earl or Baron. You cannot run for office in the House of Lords. The House of Lords, you serve for life, and your seat then gets passed on to your heir. Generally speaking, the House of Lords was a male-only institution up until, I'd say, the 1960s, 1970s. I'm not sure when the first woman sat in the House of Lords, but it was in the 1900s. The House of Lords, there has been attempts at modifying and reforming the House of Lords because of the fact that it is unelected. Today, the House of Lords is really not useless, but they don't have very much power. And I'll give you this example. Brexit happened in 2016 when they voted on it. And when Theresa May submitted to Parliament the motion to withdraw from the European Union, it was passed within the House of Commons. But when it got to the House of Lords, they sent it back and said no. Now, the reason why that's so shocking is because that was the first time it had been done in a long time. When they sent it back, though, what they told Theresa May is, we want these, I think it was 8 things. If you put these 8 things in there, fine, we'll pass it, it'll be fine. And so she put the 8 things in there, and yes, it was passed by the House of Lords. So the House of Lords, they really do kind of just rubber stamp what the House of Commons does. Now, the House of Commons, this is like our House of Representatives. They are elected to their position. They do not have term limits. We don't have term limits either for our House of Representatives. And in the beginning, these were really made up of the nobles. You had to have money because you're not being paid. Eventually, the bourgeoisie will be able to run for the House of Commons. But constitutionalism, like we see today, where there's a cabinet, was developed in the 1700s, where we have a cabinet of ministers. That's the creation of the prime minister, the foreign minister, the minister of defense, places like that. Again, in England, the prime minister is the head of government, and the king is the head of the country. If you really want another way to think about it, I am the head of my household, but I have no power because this is the head of our government. Because I do what he wants. Because if I don't, he'll probably eat my face. Right? Isn't that right? Yes. He just loves to join you guys. He likes to see you guys learn. English constitutionalism will become, again, this is for American government. It's the basis of the governments of the British colonies, the House of Burgesses, the Mayflower Compact, the Connecticut Constitution. I'm forgetting here. I haven't taught U.S. history in years. I know that's really bad. I'm an American. I can't remember U.S. history. But so you can see this is where we kind of get the term constitutionalism from, because we called ours a constitution and we drew everything from the British, right? That's the one thing that I really don't like about American education. We love to say that America came up with something so new. It's not that we came up with something so new. What we did is we took all of these different parts of development of constitutionalism from history and put it all together. That's what was new. And so we put it all together, okay? But constitutionalism as a whole, we didn't create. That was a historical development that had been happening over time, right? Excuse me, I apologize. So, as a wrap up, to look at absolutism versus constitutionalism, you can see here, in absolutism, power is held by the monarch and monarch alone. While in constitutionalism, it is limited and usually expressed through a constitution. To my knowledge, every country that has been developed since America wrote its constitution in 1789 now has a constitution. I could be wrong, so please don't quote me on that. But to my knowledge, that is what most countries do now, is they write a constitution to outline the power that the government has and does not have. I think there are probably still some that don't, like England, but to my knowledge, most of them do. So we did have a big effect in that regard. Laws under absolutism are made by the monarch and the monarch alone. Whether the law is good for the people or not, the monarch does what the monarch wants. While in England at that time, it was common law built on the rulings of judges and precedents. Now, you asked earlier, Katie, I'm sorry, can someone break precedent? Yes, they can. But if they're going to break precedent, normally what they do is they cite a different precedent as the reason why. So I'll give you an example. 2015, the United States Supreme Court, in a decision of 5-4, legalized gay marriage throughout the United States. Okay, very controversial, very, very big decision. Now, one of the things that the Supreme Court was doing at that time is the Supreme Court was breaking precedent, because normally the Supreme Court had allowed states to decide what they were going to make as their laws in marriage. That was until 1967, I think it was 1967, when it was Loving versus Virginia. Loving versus Virginia was the first time that states' anti-Black white marriage laws were challenged and made their way to the Supreme Court. At that time, the Supreme Court ruled that it was against the Constitution for a state to limit marriage to whites only or blacks only, and that states cannot prevent white and black from marrying. Fast forward to 2015. We now have gay marriage before the court. The court used that precedent set in 1967 to break the precedent that they had set since then of not getting involved in marriage. Because 2015 wasn't the first time that someone had tried to get gay marriage passed in the United States. Wasn't the first time that it had made its way up the courts all the way to the top. But by then, the Supreme Court decided that it was a time to change the whole law of the United States. So they broke the earlier precedent set by the lower courts that states had the right to set marriages they want, and used the 1967 ruling to say, no, we have a constitution that says that we are all equal before the law. Therefore, if we are all equal before the law, you cannot say marriages between a man and a woman only, that we are going to allow gay marriage. Again, very controversial ruling, whether you're looking at it from a religious standpoint or not. If we look at it from a law standpoint, controversial for that regard, that it broke precedent. It's controversial for the regard that Loving versus Virginia was still man and woman. It was not gay marriage. Loving versus Virginia was about race relations. So in regards to, was it about marriage? Most people would say no. Loving versus Virginia was race relations. It goes along with the Brown versus Board of Education. It goes along with the case of Chinese parents who sued the government education system in California for equal access to education. It's those types of law that one was ruling on. So breaking precedent is a very big thing, Katie. It's not done lightly. It's not usually done at all. If it is done, the judge has to cite where they're getting their idea from. We don't just say, okay, you can break precedent. You can come up with what you want. You've got to have a root in the law somewhere in order for you to change what is going on. So that's why it's very hard to change and break precedent, which is why in England, they're so able to continue having this form of constitutionalism because it's so hard to break precedent. So I hope that answers your question. I see you said, okay, good. So under absolutism, taxes, they are decided by the king and dictated to the people. There's no asking, there's no voting. Under constitutionalism, people give consent in one of two ways. We can vote, we vote directly on those taxes, which sometimes we do. I'll give you an example. In Texas, where I was living, they're having a vote on a state amendment to prevent income tax. Don't get me started. And other times, what we do is we vote on our representatives. By voting on our representatives, we have given consent for that representative to vote yes or no on taxes. That's why some political theorists say United States and England and most countries don't have democracy. They have indirect democracy or republics. Because you and I are not voting on every single thing, therefore it's not democracy. You're splitting hairs with it in one regard, and in another regard, it is very important to understand that there are different forms of democracy, okay? Technically, Iran is a democracy. In fact, it is one of the strongest democracies in the world. Do you know why? Almost 90 to 95% of their population votes in every single election. The United States can barely crack 50 sometimes. By definition, that means Iran has a better democracy than we do. It's a theocratic democracy. Their democracy is based in Islamic law. It is based in the Islamic religion, but it is still democracy. So kind of keep in the back of your mind as you go through this, especially when you get into the Enlightenment. Democracy is not a one-size-fits-all. Democracy doesn't look the same everywhere. Most Americans would be shocked to know that in countries like England or Australia, if you commit a crime and you're talking to your lawyer and you admit it, that lawyer is no longer your lawyer because they're going to report you to the police. There is no such thing as attorney-client privilege. In America, we have attorney-client privilege. If I tell my attorney I did something, he can't tell the judge. I think if it's murder, he could. But like if it's, yeah, I stole this money and then I gave it back, like there's always gray lines. Just remember that. Sorry, the cat's fur got in my face. Representation under absolutism, none, but here's the caveat to that, okay? Denmark has had a constitution much longer than any of the European nations. I think it's since around 1,000 or 1,100 they had a constitution that did create a parliament. When they created their absolute monarch, it was still within the confines of that constitution. England had an absolute monarch, sort of, with Charles I, as well as James I. There was still a parliament. There was arguing back and forth. They tried to be an absolute monarch. France had the Estates General. Louis XIV didn't call them, but they were still there, okay? Under constitutionalism, there is representation, but again, in the beginning, there is no commoners being represented. It is only going to be the nobles and then the rich. Eventually, commoners will be represented because we've demanded our rights, and we'll get to that in the 1800s, as I like to call it, the long century. And then sovereignty, who holds the true power of the government in absolutism, it's the monarch. In constitutionalism, it is the people. So hopefully this makes constitutionalism, absolutism make more sense. You can take everything from those other streams, put it all together now, and kind of see where they're developing it and why they're developing it. Katie, you said, so they still have noble titles in England. Yes, they do. They still do have noble titles in England. Give you an example, Meghan Markle is the Duchess of Sussex. Okay, she was given that noble title when she married Prince Harry. Another example, I don't know if you've ever watched Downton Abbey. It's a guilty pleasure of mine. That is filmed at Highclere Castle, which is the Earl of Raleigh? No, that's the family from the movie. The Earl of... I'll have to look it up. But the family that owns that castle is a noble family. They're earls. So you have earls, So if my memory serves me correct, you have barons at the bottom. Then you have earls. Then you have a marquis. Then you have a duke, prince, king, queen. Okay. No, Meghan cannot have political power in the House of Lords because she's not a British subject. To my knowledge, she has not become one. I could be wrong. But she also cannot have political power in the House of Lords because she's part of the royal family. In England, the immediate royal family, so that's the king, the queen, their children, and their grandchildren, cannot get involved in politics. They are forbidden from getting involved in politics. If they do, that can create a constitutional crisis because that developed after George III and the American Revolution. When it's George III, we know suffered from quite a few mental health issues and meddled in politics to the point of it's quite possible we might not have broken away if he had stayed out of politics. And instead, we would have a different system than we do now in America. I would say, think of Lord Rothschild. That's a famous banker, very famous banking family. I would say more famous than the Medicis, actually, more rich than the Medicis as well. The Rothschilds are lords. They're barons. They have a seat in the House of Lords. And it gets passed down from son to son to son to son. England still has primogeniture. Under Salic law is the oldest male gets the seat. If there are no males, then it goes to the female, except for certain aspects. That includes inheriting certain titles as well as a seat in the House of Lords. So it's very convoluted system they have there because you would think that in 2019, the House of Lords, fine, you want to call it the House of Lords, should be called Lord of, I don't know, yada yada Nottingham. They would be elected still, right? That they wouldn't just get this like automatic seat because they have the title Lord. So let's go look at our poll. And would you rather have lived in the time of English constitutional development or absolutist France? Right now we're at 50-50. I would say 6 is one is half a dozen to another. This time frame was a very difficult time frame. A lot of upheaval. Obviously, not just the 30 Years' War, but you have the English Civil War, things like that. So it's, again, going to be very difficult. And then I posed this question to you. Which is a more stable form of government, absolute monarchy or constitutional democracy? Here's the reason why I posed this question to you, because this is something that is a new phenomenon that we are seeing in the whole world. That recent polls have shown that a lot of young people, my age and younger, and I'm not that old, I'm in my 30s, are stating that they would rather have a monarchy than they would a democracy. And here's the thing. I'm not saying they're right or wrong because I think both systems have their pluses and their minuses. All right, there's no true form of government that is a good form of government. It all is going to suck. But historically speaking, if we take all of history into account, monarchy, absolute monarchy, has been more stable than democracy. Democracy is such a new thing that we still don't know if it's going to work. Okay, if you look at Russia, for example, Russia did try democracy before it went communist. Okay. Countries have tried democracy before and it didn't work because one thing that democracy cannot stop is democracy can't stop the divisions that are naturally occurring with people. With monarchy and absolute monarchy, the divisions don't matter because the monarch is the only one that has the power. Like it or not, it doesn't matter. You can't do anything about it. So I would say that democracy is still very young. We are still very much in an experimental time period. History might not look at this time period as being a great time period. Democracy allowed for World War I, World War II. Democracy allowed for the Rwanda genocide and for the Bosnian genocide. Absolute monarchy really didn't have these issues. That doesn't mean that people weren't massacred. That doesn't mean that there weren't people targeted by their ethnicity, religion, or race. There were, but not on the scale that we've seen since democracy. So it's just something that I'd like to pose to my students when we talk about this topic, because we're so taught that democracy, 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 that we really don't even stop to consider the other side of the coin. Because really, it is just the other side of the coin. The best thing I can ever teach you about government, okay, is that no matter what government is, all it is who has the monopoly on coercion, meaning who can convince you to do what they want. If it's a monarch, then you have a monarchy. If it's democracy, then you have a democracy. But it all is about convincing you about what they want done. Katie, you asked, what is Russia now? That is a very difficult question to answer. If you had asked this question 20 years ago, when I was 13, I would have told you Russia is a democracy. Today, I would tell you Russia is an oligarchy, which means rule by the few rich elites, pushing a monarchy or totalitarian dictatorship. And remember, we like to think of politics as a line. Politics is not a line. Politics is circular, okay? If you were to compare the qualities of fascism and the qualities of communism, they're almost identical. All right, the difference between them is how are you getting to power? One gets to power through the idea of workers' rights and the liberation of the masses. One gets to power through the idea of nationalism and racism. But in the end, they do the same thing: mass murder, theft of property, theft of goods, theft of money. So Russia, right now, I mean, I can't really answer that question. Because of how Putin has been in power and how the country's been run, oligarchy or totalitarian is the easiest I can give you, but it doesn't fit like that because, again, politics isn't a line, it's a circle. And once you reach one end, you just start going back around, right? So, guys, I hope this helps you guys. Please make sure you join us tomorrow. It will lead directly from this stream into the Enlightenment. It's all going to come together and make sense for you. And if you have any questions, I'm going to be here for a couple more minutes. Ask away. I will answer them. And thank you again for joining me. I really appreciate it. Bye, guys. Kia kaha.